the Western industrialized nations and Japan have mugged the climate to nearly a point of extinction, but it's, it could well be the blows and the hits and the kicks from China, Brazil that bring about that extinction. I'm David Korn, the Washington Bureau Chief of Mother Jones Magazine and a columnist for politicsdaily.com. And I'm sitting in what looks to be a furniture showroom, but really I'm at the Copenhagen Climate Summit. Imagine holding a gathering to decide the future of the world in one big giant IKEA. I know IKEA is Swedish and this is Danish, but to most Americans that difference often gets lost in the wash. But that's what's going on here in Copenhagen at what's called COP15. There are COPs, there are MOPs, there are LCAs going on here. It's all rather confusing. I came here at the beginning of the previous week. This is a 2-week endeavor, and quickly realized that what I thought I knew about the international diplomatic process in terms of climate change was completely wrong. It's not just that the nations of the world get together and argue about who should cut how much and who should pay for what. It's really about arguing over process a lot, and what treaty, what legally binding instruments should be approved of by the end of the week now to enshrine whatever agreement is hammered out in terms of substance. So there's several debates going on at once. Let's put the procedure aside because it's kind of boring and hard to understand. But let me just talk about for a second the big picture. Okay? Once upon a time, there was the Kyoto Protocols that were negotiated in 1997 when Bill Clinton and Al Gore were in office. And that set up a regimen under which industrialized nations of the world agreed to pretty modest cuts in their greenhouse-causing emissions. I'm just going to assume whoever's listening understands the connection between carbon and climate change, and I'm not going to have to argue the science. So that was the beginning. Now, the U.S. never, although they signed the treaty, they never ratified it because the Congress at the time didn't want to see what they thought would be pressure on the U.S. economy. So about 37, I believe, countries became part of that regime, as they say, to start cutting. Now, of course, those cuts were small, and without the U.S. involved, it didn't really make a big difference in terms of doing anything about climate change. And then there was another little problem. Actually, it's not so little. It's called China and India and Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia. These countries are all still officially developing countries, but they are now becoming, in fact, China, I think, is now surpassing the United States as the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. So Kyoto basically said, and there's some sense to this at the time, said the industrialized nations that have already polluted the atmosphere and have brought it to the brink of perhaps a breaking point, if not a tipping point, you guys have to go first. You have to start cutting because it's kind of unfair to expect the developing countries, who are only now catching up with you in terms of economic development and getting rid of poverty, for them to do the same thing. So basically at Kyoto, it was decided the big Western countries and Japan, they go first. Okay, fast forward 12 years now, and we see that while the industrialized nations still have the commitment to get rid of global warming, the case they are making at the moment, it is somewhat convenient for them, but it also has the benefit of being true, is that these other countries, these big emerging developing nations, are going to be responsible between now and 2020 for about 97%, that's almost all, of future growth in emissions in the atmosphere. So their argument is, the developed nations, that hey, we can cut as much as you may like, but it won't really do what needs to be done to save the planet unless these other nations kick in too. Now the other nations say, well, wait a second, we have this deal that you go first. And then they throw something else into the mix. We need money. There is a general agreement that the developed nations, which have gotten rich by befouling the atmosphere with these greenhouse gases that are going to affect everyone around the world, not just in those nations that got rich, have some sort of commitment in terms of big dollars to the poorer nations of the world to help them contend with climate change. That could be by helping them, pay for the measures they need to lower their emissions. It could be for building seawalls or other developing clean energy technologies, maybe even for moving populations in some small island nations. I mean, all these things are on the table. But the numbers we're talking about are, while not big in relative terms, they are big in, average people terms. We're talking about perhaps going up to a couple $100 billion a year. The US and Europe now are talking about tens of billions annually for the next few years. But the developing nations, including China, say, no, we need to see you guys kick in hundreds of billions of dollars at some point down the road. Okay, so what are they willing to do, the developing nations? They've started putting plans on the table. China, India, Mexico. China's plan in particular, it's complicated, but they basically say they will slow the growth of their carbon intensity, meaning basically slow the increases in emissions. And some environmentalists are very encouraged that they've done something and they're taking some steps. The US and the West, Europe, come back and say, well, thank you very much for that plan. We need now to make that plan legally binding and verifiable. Under the Kyoto Protocol, the industrialized nations that have to cut emissions, which doesn't include the United States, have to do so, and they're legally bound to do so. And there are all sorts of verification mechanisms in place to make sure that they're meeting their commitments. So the United States and the West says to China, hey, thank you so much for your good faith efforts. There'd be a little more good faith involved if we could have transparency and verification of exactly what you're doing. China says, hey, we'll tell you, we'll give you our word and we'll stand by it, and these will be nationally binding actions, meaning we'll pass our own laws to say we must do this, and we will have monitoring and we'll gladly share our data with you. Well, to the West, that's not good enough because it's not independent. And one whole principle here at Copenhagen is how to get a legally binding instrument. That's what these diplomats call treaties, instruments that will enshrine what all these nations claim they're going to do. Now we get to I hope you've stayed with me so far. Am I doing okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So part of this gets played out in procedural battles. I mentioned earlier there was the Kyoto Protocol. The U.S. was part of that. Well, it wasn't part of that. So with the U.S. not being part of it, the rest of the world realized, hey, we got to get the U.S. involved, and they started having conversations outside of the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol conversations are negotiations that would come about every couple times a year to continue that treaty process and to get more people involved and get deeper cuts were called MOPs. So the UN, UNFCCC, the UN something for climate change, created the Conference of the Parties, COPs, C-O-P. That's why we call Copenhagen COP15. This is the 15th meeting, the 15th Conference of the Parties. So those parties include the United States. And those parties are negotiating what the U.S. should be doing. And in the terms of those negotiations and those talks, that's where the U.S. and the West are trying to say to the major developing countries, hey, we want another legally binding instrument, another agreement that's separate from Kyoto, and that can come out of the COP process. Now, the developing nations of the world say, hey, we like Kyoto. So there's been this whole argument back and forth over the course of this convention, this climate summit, about where, the commitments that are made are going to be enshrined, embodied, if at all. And the developing nations say, we don't want to get rid of Kyoto, which is the only legally binding treaty we have, until we know what's going to happen with another legally binding treaty. And it seems that time is running out for this summit to produce a true replacement for Kyoto that would include the United States and that might also include the major developing countries and give them targets and obligations in terms of review and verification as well. So, so this procedural battle also gives countries, cover or arguments to hide behind. And I'm not begrudging anybody or questioning anyone's, good faith. But today, we're talking on Monday. I don't know when you'll be seeing this, but today there was a little scuffle when the president of the summit, announced that there would be informal consultations focused more on the COP than the MOP. That is more on what they call the LCA, the effort to get a new agreement, more or less, that would embody the U.S. and that would put pressure on the emerging developing countries to, join in more. And the bloc of African nations said to them it looked like this was going to spell the death of the Kyoto protocols. So they protested, things came to a halt for a while, then they got up and running again. But it gives the developing nations sort of a hammer to swing at the United States and the West and say, we've already worked out a way to do this. And now you want to come in and tell us it's no good? Well, we're not going to change, we're not going to jump ships until we see what the other ship is. This comes back to money and how much the U.S. and the West are going to put on the table in long-term funding. So these procedural issues, again, provide cover for some of the bigger fights we have. And, there are all these different face-offs that go on here. I mentioned the developing world and the U.S., but even within there, U.S. and the West, there are sort of face-offs within the face-offs. Within the developing world, there are nations, particularly small island nations, that are worried as much about Chinese emissions as American emissions, and they can see that no matter what's happened in the past, what's going to cause their islands to go underwater or their floodplains to go up will be the emissions from China, India, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, not from the United States and Europe, who are heading towards flattening out, even though the U.S. proposed rates of 17% below 2005 is really quite small, and everybody wants to see them do more. They're on a trend path, a trend or a glide path, as the diplomats say, to a much more stabilized output. There are still things that may go wrong with that, so I don't want to be overly optimistic here. But getting back to those small island nations and the most at-risk nations, including those in Africa that worry about water stress and droughts if temperatures go up too high, they have to look at China and Brazil and Indonesia as well. I like to say that it's just sort of a situation where imagine mugging someone nearly to the point of death, then and then another group comes along and does the fatal kicks. The Western industrialized nations and Japan have mugged the climate to nearly a point of extinction, but it could well be the blows and the hits and the kicks from China, Brazil that bring about that extinction or a tipping point, and we get to irreversible climate change. So that said, the tiny Pacific island state of Tuvalu proposed, let's have a Kyoto Protocol continue, and let's have another legally binding instrument that would wrap in the United States and China and the emerging developing economies. And that caused a split because the that was the point where the major developing countries didn't support that. So usually those groups are all together, but not on that. And finally, there's a little, probably not finally, but perhaps we'll stop after this. There's been one big point of contention has been whether to aim for a 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise, which would be, I think, 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or a 1.5 degrees Celsius global temperature rise at whenever you sort of peak in greenhouse gas emission. And the idea is basically, some people will say it has to be more stringent, but to have a peak year by 2020 at maybe 2 degrees, somewhere between 2 degrees and 1 degree Celsius. Now, it may not sound like a lot. If you're sitting in your backyard, the difference between 32 degrees Celsius and 30.5 degrees Celsius may not matter much while you're barbecuing. Unfortunately, it does matter a lot to the globe. And that's an average. The African nations worry quite rightfully, and the science backs them up on this, that if you have a 2% global boost in temperatures, that you could end up in Africa with a 3.5 to 4 degree Celsius rise. Now you're talking real problems. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN-backed group of thousands of scientists that have done most of this climate change science, has said in reports that could lead to 1.8 billion with a B, Africans, just in Africa alone, the continent alone, going without water. Imagine, the national security consequences of that. So the African nations are saying, to the Western nations, you are condemning us to death. We don't want to sign anything that sort of enshrines the 2% target as an acceptable aim. We want 1%, 1.5%, if not lower. Now, the U.S. position has been, given what's happened with the atmosphere so far, given political realities in the United States and elsewhere, we can't, 2% is the best we can shoot for. Todd Stern, the climate envoy, said, I won't argue with my friends about 1.5% when they say that, but we have to combine science with politics and be pragmatic. African nations, as I say earlier, saying your pragmatism is going to kill us. Now, there are developing nations, island, especially some of the small island states, that drastically want the 1.5. Yet China and India, these big powerhouses, don't want 1.5 because that would put more pressure on them to do more. Because again, as I said earlier, it's the future emitters that are going to create this problem in the next 10, 20 years. So you have this split within the developed world, or the developing world, on 1.5, 2.0. I've asked Europeans about this, and they say, European negotiators, they're very sympathetic to the 1.5 position. But they're not advocating it themselves, but they're leaning that way. And the Europeans are saying we're offering to cut 20% by 2020 below 1990 levels. We would go up to 30% if the U.S. did more. So can the U.S. do more? They're basically proposing 4% below 1990 levels. So we have a lot to play out. There are a lot of competing forces. There are a lot of domestic political concerns for a lot of different countries. There's a lot of grandstanding. There's a lot of brinksmanship, gamesmanship. And the bottom line is, at the start of week 2, the negotiators who came here, all the mid-level people, have not closed these gaps. They have not brought the process far enough along. So now the ministers arrive, and then at the end of the week, the heads of states arrive. And in an ideal world, the heads of states come and they sign the final agreement. They make big speeches. But a lot of work is being left at the ministerial level, as they say here, and perhaps at the heads of state level. You know, at the end of the day, it may be Barack Obama has to come in and say, listen, I have this recalcitrant Senate back home. I can only go so far, but I'm doing all I can. I'm going to make climate change a #1 priority and keep pushing, and I need some more concessions from you, Mr. and Mrs. China, in order to make things work at home. And that may have to be done to the president of China. It may have to be done, you know, Gordon Brown, the leader of England, may have to get people in the room and knock heads together. And as we're talking now, it's an open question whether any of this can get done, whether there will be something. There won't be a treaty, whether there will be something close to a treaty, whether we'll have real cuts, what obligations will be compelled, what obligations will be held by China, India, Brazil, how far the United States is going to go, and what will be needed after this. You know, people talk about at the end of this there'll be a lot of leftover matters, and if there's no binding treaty, then we have 6 to 12 months, not necessarily realizing that in America, the politics of this are likely to get more difficult in the next 6 to 12 months if Obama's popularity goes down, if there's more pressure to focus on jobs, and as we approach the midterm elections. I've gone on a little bit too long, and I hope there's a good editor out there, but I'll leave on this point. Just a few moments ago, before I sat down on this lovely, comfortable red Danish couch, although it doesn't look good if you want to take a nap, we ran into Dr. Pachauri, who is the head of the aforementioned IPCC, the scientific body that does all the science that underpins all the talking that's going on here. And I asked him where he thought the negotiations were. And because I'm an accurate journalist, I will get my notes out. And so we were talking about the negotiations process, and he said, quote, "It's all very baffling to me. This is a fellow who truly understands the science of climate change, why there's climate change, what climate change will do, down to the molecular level, from the molecular level to the global atmospheric level. And these negotiations are baffling him." You can imagine what it means for the rest of us. Anyway, I'll sign off here. I'm David Korn with Mother Jones Magazine and ALL's politicsdaily.com, live on tape from this lovely furniture showroom where we're trying, or other people at least, are trying to save the planet.